Somalia's financial lifeline remains under threat as banks in the US, UK, Australia and elsewhere break ties with money transfer operators that make remittances possible. We stay with the story and seek answers as to how this can be resolved. This is Global Business. Hello and thank you for joining us. I am Penny Nakaribe in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. There's plenty coming up tonight, including these stories. Stockbrokers in Kenya threaten to halt trading over imposition of capital gains tax, and how failure by Congo's government to implement a subsidized transport system is hurting commuters. Last week, Merchant Bank in the US shut down the remaining accounts of companies that were operating money transfer services from Somalis in the diaspora. The Somali government has been pushing for a review, but 2 weeks later, little progress has been made. Mohamed Hirmoge reports from Mogadishu that many are hurting from the closure.
Remittances are the lifeline of Somalia's economy. Up to $2 billion is sent from abroad every year, mainly through the informal Hawala network. Millions living overseas send money home to their families. That support, though, has been threatened of late. Banks argue that the Hawala firms lacked controls to monitor where their money goes.
It's because there are regulations to safeguard money transfer, to make sure money is not going to an actress that the US deemed to be a terrorist. So they stop money transfer simply because of their fear they might break the rules that was imposed by the US Treasury Department.
40% of the population here relies on remittances from abroad as their only source of income. But how long this lifeline can remain is a big question. This is a country faced with one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. Statistics show nearly 2/3 of the youth do not have jobs. Thus, Abdurrashid Mohammed's extended family only relied on remittances from relatives in the United States.
We're a big family of 10. We rely only on remittance cash from abroad. That's our only source of income. This month we didn't receive any money, and we had to borrow to pay bills of such an extended family. It could get worse if we don't get the remittances in the coming months.
The money that we receive in Somalia is used for basic needs: food, medicine, and school tuition. Imagine if a family who used to receive money every month to buy food no longer have that money. They might starve. The family who used to send their children to school and pay for it for remittance will no longer able to afford to pay the tuition. Those children will stay home.
Prime Minister Abdurrashid Sharmarke is now appealing to the United States to consider temporary reprieve until a permanent solution is found.
It is a fact that millions of people survive on these remittances. We are talking about people who cannot afford to pay basic bills, housing, food and medicine. Thus, we are requesting the American government to intervene until we find a permanent solution.
Experts say cutting off services to remittance companies could drive the remittance businesses underground, thus making it difficult for millions to support their families. In the meantime, the Somali government is trying to push for diplomatic solutions to try and find temporary reprieve. Mohamed Hirmoge, CCTV, Mogadishu.
Now, Adesso, Oxfam and the Global Center on Cooperative Security warned that Somalia's financial lifeline is under threat as banks in the US, UK, Australia and elsewhere cut ties with international money transfer operators. Every year, remittances account for up to 45% of Somalia's economy and outstrips the amount received in aid and foreign direct investment. The report, titled Hanging by a Thread, focuses on international efforts to facilitate remittances to Somalia since July 2013. Identifying successes but also significant gaps in the response. It highlights responses in the US and the UK, the two countries with the highest populations of Somali diaspora, and where the threat to the remittance system is most acute. All right, so let's widen this discussion. We do have from London, Mariam Bamad. Mariam, always a pleasure to have you with us. And here in studio, we have Anne-Marie Schreier-Roy, the Communications and Advocacy Manager from ADESO, the authors of the report. Anne-Marie, a pleasure to have you in studio also. Let me begin with you, because the threat to Somali remittances really isn't a new one. As your report indicated, we've been dealing with it since 2013.
Yes.
Have any strides been made?
Strides have been made. Unfortunately, we seem to be moving from one crisis to the next and always putting in stopgap measures. But we do have to say that the UK and the US governments have both made efforts to move the situation forward. The US government has made public commitments to support the money transfer companies. The UK government has put in a safer corridor pilot to increase the confidence of banks in working with money transfer companies. There have been strides, but at the same time, now we're facing, again, account closures with Merchants Bank of California and the U.S. closing 2 weeks ago.
Right.
And so every time we take a step forward, we seem to be taking a few back.
Let's focus on the three countries, the US, the UK and Australia, the way they've responded to this crisis. Of the three, which country would you say has made the most effort to help the Somalis in the diaspora?
I think it's difficult to say which one has made the most efforts. They've all made efforts in their own ways. The unfortunate thing is that it's moving quite slowly. We're facing a crisis right now. We've faced crisis in the past, and we can't keep going from, as I mentioned, from one crisis to the other. The UK government has made a lot of efforts, as I said, with the Safer Corridor pilot. Unfortunately, it's only a pilot, and well, it's still taking time to be implemented. The UK government has also put together a working group or a task force and is looking at what the UK government is doing and trying to follow the example. But again, we need immediate measures, as we're raising in the report, as we're raising in our press release, because we're facing a situation now where the flow of remittances to Somalia could really be reduced by up to 60 to 80% from the US.
Right. Well, Mariam, let's bring you in. And remittances to Somalia were the subject of discussion about an hour ago at the Chatham House in London. How do investors on your end view Somalia?
Well, Panina, Somalia doesn't have a great image with investors, but that's slowly changing. You know, the biggest problem has been that since 1991, when the central government collapsed, Somalia doesn't have a functioning commercial banking system. And investors know that there's very limited relationships with foreign banks, and it's still considered a high-risk country with all financial transactions. In fact, despite Somalia's money transfer system being relatively affordable and accessible to customers, many investors that I spoke with say that they cannot rely on the government's regulations and policies and deem the money transfer sector as flawed. At the same time, though, Somalia is a key destination for countries like the UAE, Yemen, Oman, and Kenya, to name a few, in things like food processing and more recently the telecommunications sector. So the potential is there.
Right. So, due to Somalia's banking system, Mariam, there's been limited foreign capital flows. How can the government improve this?
Well, the government is working with various international officials to help develop a new system. In fact, along with the US and Australia, as Anne-Marie was saying, officials from the UK as well and the World Bank are working to enhance Somali money remitters in local banks. You know, we have to remember there's a big domestic demand for this. Millions of Somalis living abroad use money transfer companies to send more than $1.3 billion home each year, far more than the country actually receives in aid. But because of a lack of government policy, lack of security, and of course alleged transfer fund concerns to terrorist groups, most major US banks, for example, have had little or no banking services to Somalia in the last few years. And that's why Britain has been working with the World Bank on a safer corridor initiative to tighten the security of money transfers through measures like biometric identity cards for recipients in Somalia.
All right. So, Anne-Marie, let me come to you. The closure of these accounts obviously affects millions in Somalia and as well as living abroad. How can those in the diaspora help themselves?
I think the first thing is one of the most unfortunate things with these closures is that this is a system where the Somali diaspora is helping people in Somalia. As Mariam said, there's more money and remittances every year than there is in foreign aid and foreign direct investment combined. So we're closing down a system where the diaspora is trying to help its own people. In terms of what the diaspora can do now, there's actually been quite a lot of social media action from the diaspora. There's a hashtag that says "I fund food, not terror" that's been trending quite a lot. The more awareness the diaspora can raise about these issues, the better. Organizing public events, lobbying with MPs, members of government in the US, UK, Australia, the more pressure they can put, the more likely it is that governments will also react.
And your report has made several recommendations. Can you outline for us the main three?
I think right now one of the recommendations that have come to the forefront because of the Merchants Bank closure is the need to put in emergency measures in the US, because we're seeing a reduction in the flows already because a lot of the money transfer companies are not able to operate as they were able to operate before. So the few things the US government could do, they could put in place a special regulatory regime. So for example, safe harbor regulations so that banks dealing with MTOs, money transfer operators, are protected. They could also appoint a public financial institution, for example, the New York Federal Reserve, to transfer the money to Somalia on behalf of the money transfer operators. So I think that's a key recommendation because of the crisis we're facing now. The second key recommendation, I think, is for the money transfer companies themselves to come together as a sector to form a global trade organization and make sure they're complying to high quality standards. And the third one, which is a longer-term project, but obviously the Somali government needs to improve financial regulation and transparency, because ultimately if Somalia had a functioning banking sector, we wouldn't be having all of these challenges either.
All right. Well, let's rope in Mohamed Hirmoge. He's joining us now live from Somalia's capital, Mogadishu. So Hirmoge, it's now 2 weeks since Merchants Bank cut off remittance operations to Somalia. How significant has been the impact?
Well, Penina, impacts are already showing. Earlier today, I met a young man who told me that he comes from a family of 10, and that because of the unemployment rate and low per capita income in this city, he said they only relied on $200 that they receive from the US, which didn't come this month actually. And he told me that they only did with debts. He said the shops were lenient for the first month, and he said the prospects in the future are quite bleak, and that whole family of 10 don't know what to do in the coming months or weeks in case Merchant Bank doesn't reactivate the services he had with remittance companies in this country. We understand Somalia is a country that is facing enormous challenges. It's a country that reels from over 2 decades of civil war, cyclic droughts, and an insurgency over here. Plus, we understand the central government is too weak and cannot be able to provide incentives for its people. And that's why these remittances are a critical lifeline. Statistics show 40% of the population in Somalia depend on this lifeline. Therefore, impacts are already showing, and people are saying, experts actually are saying, it's going to get worse.
Right, so let's talk about that. Let's pick it up from there, Mohammed. What is the biggest risk to Somalia's economy if this situation persists?
Well, per se, the Somali economy does not only rely on remittances from abroad, because the big businesses over here, the telecommunication industry, for example, and the internet services, don't solely rely in as much the same way as the public, the population, the larger population, the 40% of the population rely on these remittances abroad. But of course, it will have effects. Ultimately, remittances have effects on the lifeline of the people and not so much on the businesses. But here is the fear. The fear is, number one, people here fear that this business will go underground. And once it gets underground, it's going to make it difficult for people to support their families back home, because without regulations, people will not be able to receive their money. And if they do, they're going to receive it at a higher cost because it's gone underground and will be operating illegally. Besides, people are saying Merchant Bank, like Barclays Bank last year, is setting a bad precedent. It's now time before other banks, other major banks who are offering similar services across the globe to Somalis in the diaspora follow suit, because the threat is already there, because the finance regulatory in these countries are concerned about what they call terror financing and money laundering. And it's a real threat. Besides, the Somali government is too weak at the moment. It does not have proper frameworks to tighten scrutiny on where this money goes. The Hawala system, the remittance companies, the Somali locals cannot provide the safeguards to ensure that this money indeed goes to the people and doesn't finance terror activities.
Right.
People are really concerned, and that is why the Prime Minister, speaking earlier yesterday, said that indeed this might ultimately have an impact on security.
Well, valid concerns indeed there. Mohammed Jirmoge live for us in Mogadishu. We had Mariam Bamat live for us in London, and here in studio, Anne-Marie Schreier-Roy. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, Kenyan stockbrokers are threatening to stop trading at the Nairobi Securities Exchange this Friday over imposition of a capital gains tax. And this, as you will see later, as the bourse rallied to another all-time high. Kenya implemented a 5% capital gains tax in January, but investors say that it could affect investment in equities and the country's growing oil and mining sectors. The Kenya Association of Stockbrokers and Investment Bankers said its members would stop work at the NSE from Friday until March 18th. The Brokers Association has already filed papers in court asking for the lifting of the tax on traded shares. They're also upset by a requirement that they deduct capital gains tax on traded stocks on behalf of the state. Investors have been chasing Kenyan stocks and fueling a rally in shares. Kenya is now the world's 7th highest producer of geothermal power following the unveiling of its all-carrier geothermal plant, adding an extra 280 megawatts to the national grid. The country's electricity producer, KenGen, has already said that geothermal is saving the country more than $24 million a month on fuel costs. Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta said that there would be further reductions in the cost of power for industries and households. More than 17,000 primary schools have been connected to the grid following the increased power production, and all 30,000 primary schools in the country are expected to be connected to the grid by May.
We are now ready to start exporting electricity to our brothers and sisters in Eastern Africa. Through the Electricity Generation and Interconnectivity Framework, we are sharing in the spirit of East African solidarity and shared prosperity. The people of Rwanda are getting ready to import electric power and power transformation in their country as well.
You see, we are coming from a position where, much as we need to leapfrog, we can't say we have got to do things the way they were done 30, 40 years ago. Today, renewables are the way to go, so we will go renewable. But I don't think we should take too much time debating that, as we should take sufficient time to find ways in which we can be able to deliver electricity. Before it even becomes clean for me, it must be there.
Well, let's go through the markets now. And like we mentioned earlier, Kenyan stockbrokers are threatening to stop trading at the Nairobi Stock Exchange from Friday over a new capital gains tax. Brokers were saying on Thursday as the bourse rallied to another all-time high. The news, however, came at the end of trade today, and so the bourse's performance wasn't really affected. It gained by slightly over 0.5%. You're watching Global Business. We're taking a short break. We'll be right back with plenty more.
Sustainable development and a commitment to developing partnerships with Africa. Some of the key phrases already used at the Africa Global Business Forum here in Dubai.
There is a need for a predictable environment in which investors have to put their money.
You're watching Global Business. Welcome back. Many residents of Congo's city of Point Noir are struggling to cope with the high cost of commuting as the government's proposed subsidized transport system fails to take off. While there is a private bus and taxi network, commuters say they're being exploited as there are no other alternatives.
Point Noir is Congo's main commercial center, home to over 1 million people. At the moment, many residents are struggling to keep up with the high cost of commuting to and from work. The government's promised subsidized transport system has not been implemented. Those affected are mainly low-income earners and civil servants, and the lack of alternative and affordable transport is pushing many to the fringes of poverty.
We had got the news from the media that the government had ordered public transport buses, but we don't understand. They only fed us with hope. We do not see the facts. We are really suffering.
While there is a taxi bus network that runs throughout the entire city, private transporters are taking advantage of the lack of alternative transport to overcharge commuters.
To go to work, you must contribute to the cost of a taxi, which is about 500 francs per person.
Despite the harsh reality facing many in their daily commute, residents are still optimistic that the government's promised transport network will be implemented soon. Voldika Rosa, CCTV.
Middle-class targeted online retail stores are increasingly meeting a demand for products that conventional retail struggles to satisfy due to a shortage of malls and grinding traffic. While the online retail sector is still in its infancy on the continent, big international e-commerce firms are betting on the continent and are looking to expand or enter the market through acquisition.
Justin Christensen wades through the dusty maze of downtown Kampala to convince wary shopkeepers that selling their wares online can give them an edge. With his team, Christensen has been able to make over 60,000 products available on the Kaimu platform and at a bargain price for buyers.
We have a full team of kind of professional sourcers, if you will, or personal shoppers in a way. They'll go out and interact with the sellers and source items. And in the process of sourcing those items, they negotiate on behalf of the buyer with the seller to find the best price.
Kaimu got off to a slow start in Uganda, but by June it was processing transactions worth over $48,000 a month. That figure quadrupled by December, according to Christensen. This and many other online stores across the continent are tapping into a market manufacturers and internet companies say will be big. Online retail in Africa.
The whole world is brought together and so close and everything. So I chose what I wanted and it has come more than I expected.
But the sector is still in its infancy. The internet's contribution to Africa's gross domestic product stood at 1.1% in 2013, much lower than other emerging markets. But this could rise to 10% or $300 billion by 2025, according to a report by consultants McKinsey & Company.
Online shopping is growing very fast across Africa, but off a very low base, and in some countries that base is exceptionally low. So when you see high percentage growth numbers, it doesn't really mean a lot in dollar terms, for example.
Last year, hedge fund Tiger Global invested $100 million in South African online shopping company Takealot. The German firm Rocket Internet also plowed €120 million in Nigeria-based online retailer Jumia in November. Inevitably, this sector is growing quickest in sub-Saharan Africa's steadier economies and fastest of all in South Africa. But the potential in countries such as Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal is such that online retailers say their main aim is not to beat their competitors so much as to grab a bigger slice of the overall retail market.
The smaller the retailer, the greater difficulty they have to take advantage of e-commerce, because they've got to get around the infrastructure problems that are even more challenging for them than for the bigger players.
Expansion requires attracting new customers, allaying fears of fraud, building trading platforms and mastering delivery networks. Maria Galang, CCTV.
In South Africa, many questions are still raised about the agonizingly slow transformation of the country's agricultural industry. The Western Cape particularly has been hit quite hard in the past by workers who are unhappy with low wages and poor working conditions. But as Travis Andrews now reports, that is changing.
The Western Cape's agricultural industry is the lifeblood of the local economy, which employs more unskilled labor than any other sector in South Africa. It's an industry, though, that is still largely dominated by white males, who remain in firm control of a vast majority of the region's agricultural land. Even today, with the new political discourse, not many opportunities exist in land ownership for emerging black farmers. But in Gugulethu, on the outskirts of Cape Town, opportunities in the agri-sector are beginning to present themselves to those who have chosen to embrace the richness of their township soil. Now, these streets may be anything but synonymous with the agricultural industry, but there's one female entrepreneur here that's stepping into that sector one harvest at a time. 47-year-old Namonde Kweza runs her own food garden that supplies fresh, healthy organic vegetables to the community and the surrounds. She's part of an emerging breed of township entrepreneurs that are relying on knowledge sharing and skills transfer to grow sustainable food gardens and enterprises in the township.
When we started to sell our vegetables, we have no market. Then what we did in our way local of marketing. We targeted those homes who don't have their gardens at home, and then we started to selling to them in the household, so-called household. And then demand from there, it grows up. And then we move from the household, and then we go to the clinics. And then from the clinics, the demand was high.
Overcoming adversity, she says, is key in growing a business, which has also allowed her to employ 12 seasonal workers and 6 permanent to help throughout the year's harvest. She's already been honored by the Department of Agriculture in the Western Cape as a leader in agricultural subsistence farming, a key area that's been identified as an important tool in providing food security and jobs.
Agriculture in the township is in increase because they know they can address even their poverty alleviations at home. Because whenever they're working, they know out of their budget from this month, this and that I'm not buying, it's just coming from my garden.
As a door-to-door service, the freshly picked organic vegetables are delivered daily to customers in various parts of the community, including old age homes, where the food is certainly well received.
All vegetables here definitely are healthy, but the most vegetables are these vegetables because they are organic. They are fresh from the garden, not from the garden to the fridge and then to us. Straight from the garden, we use them. That's where we are. And it's very healthy because it's our meal.
The service of the farming is very good because we are getting the lady that is making a garden here, and we have the garden ourselves, but because of the old people, we start at a time, not every time, but the time we are not starting it, we are going to this lady to buy this vegetable, and it's fresh.
The little that's left from harvesting the food for sale is taken home by Namonde and her workers to feed their families, as well as donated to impoverished residents in the community, who can all enjoy the fruits of her labor and her passion in pursuing her dream. News CCTV, Cape Town.
Let's go through the currencies now. And the Kenyan shilling was barely moved on Thursday as firms focused on settling their monthly tax bills in local currency, and traders said imported dollar demand could put it under pressure next week. The shilling has received support from dollar inflows from investors abroad looking to buy 2 treasury bonds that were on sale in a heavily oversubscribed auction on Wednesday. On Global Business tomorrow, heads of state from the East African community meet in Nairobi for the 16th Ordinary Summit of the community. They are expected to discuss progress of the community in joint projects as well as a roadmap to a political federation. We'll also be looking at the 100,000-ton boost in cotton production output that has pushed Mali slightly closer to realizing its 2018 target of 800,000 tons. And that's where we end it on Global Business tonight. Do send your feedback to globalbusinessafrica@cctv.com. You can visit us on Facebook. Our page is CCTV Africa. Stay in touch with Global Business on Twitter using the handle @CCTV News Africa. I am Penina Karibe. Thanks for your company.